Welcome, folks. So far, we've been working with MySQL using MySQL Workbench and a locally installed version of MySQL Server, right? And it's two separate products, really. MySQL Server is something that runs in the background on your computer. It is the thing that holds all the data, right? And we think of it as a server because it sits there and it waits for requests for information and holds all the tables and all the data of our database. And then we bring up a product like MySQL Workbench, which then connects to that server. We run our code, and then we're able to write queries, connects to the database server, and can extract the information and bring it back to this product, right? And so that's what MySQL Workbench is for. Now, when we're working with higher level tools, and this will happen often when we're doing higher level codings. Just for example, right? If I'm a web developer and I'm creating a website and that website stores information, I often will use MySQL to store that information. Or if I'm a coder writing an application, I might use MySQL on the back end to run the data for my application, right? And why do we use databases? The bottom line is so that the data from our applications or our websites persists. So we don't want a website where we create some information and then the next time we come back, that information is gone. That's not very helpful, right? Or if you're using an app on your phone or your computer and it generates some information, let's say you're playing a game and you want to remember your high score, you don't want to come back to that game and go, oh no, your high score is 0, starting over again this time, right? That's not what you want. You want a place where it stores. Now, when you're a web developer, we often use MySQL to drive a website on the back end, right? It becomes our data repository. And most of today's big content management systems rely on MySQL or a clone of MySQL called the Maria database, right? Which is basically another freeware open source product that a lot of website people are using. When web developers end up working with MySQL, it's not that they don't use MySQL Workbench, but more often they'll use a tool like the one that you see on the screen right now. So web students, if you are in the web program, by the time you get to your PHP class, most notably, you'll start working with the database system that's on our web server. Our web server, by the way, here at Gateway is Prometheus. So if you just hit that URL, this is our splash page. This is a place where students store all the web pages they create in the web program for viewing and grading and whatever. And then attached to that server also is an instance of MySQL. And this is really fascinating because it operates very much the same way it operates on your local computer. That is, that computer, which is, operates as a web server. But whenever we say the word server in terms of like a web server or a database server, it's really a piece of software that's running on a computer system. So Prometheus for us is our main web server for the web program, which runs web server software, FTP server software, and MySQL database software. When this database is running, it's in the background. You don't really see it, just the same way you don't see it on your Windows computer or your Mac computer. But if I want to interface with that database on the web server, we have a web-facing interface called PHPMyAdmin, which is very, very common, by the way, on most web hosting platforms. And for web developers, when you work professionally with a database and you're interacting with that database's data or writing queries, for example, it will be through this piece of software which operates through a browser. So PHPMyAdmin is what we call a DBMS, a database management system, right? That allows us to interface with the MySQL database in the background. Now, what you'll see here, and this is the landing page for this. This is kind of weird, but we have, for example, a whole bunch of user accounts. In fact, we have so many that it's broken down into the letters of the alphabet. Like, for example, here's some of our users, right? And their accounts on this machine. So a whole bunch of users on the machine. The other thing that we see here is that this database server has many databases loaded up on it. And normally what we do is we give students an account, and attached to every one of their Prometheus accounts, you will get your own custom database account. And just for example, because I have multiple ones on this system, here's one of my accounts, the CCCCC account, right? And you can see I have a couple databases in there, one to run the Drupal CMS and one to run the WordPress CMS. And if I was to dig into these databases, for example, I could see all the tables that are stored in that database and all their data. Just for example, when I use the WordPress system and I create a web page in WordPress, the data for that WordPress page is stored in the database. And interestingly, all the revisions of that web page, every time we make a revision, is also placed into that database. So whenever I create a web page and I want to step backwards and go to my previous version, I can go in the database and extract it and pull it back. This is really kind of an interesting thought, right? Okay, so the bottom line is that this is a database system that also uses MySQL. And if I wanted, for example, I can come in here and use their SQL editor. And I want you to notice this is really kind of neat, but they have like buttons down here where, like, if I want to build a query, for example, I can just say select, and it gives me all the stuff that's available in this table. And then all I have to do is edit it. Right? Kind of neat, right? And how did it drop all those in? Well, it knows all the columns that are over here, and it just automatically grabbed them, right? And then I can write my criteria, but I can write the same SQL code I'm writing in MySQL Workbench, works inside this environment. However, and I say this, right, like if I wanted to execute this query, I would just hit the go button here and it would run. But often what I'm also doing, like in systems like this, and yeah, I'm not going to execute that query, is I can come in here, for example, like if I'm in the root of my account, I can come in here and I can create a table, right? And I can just, call it whatever, right? And hit the go button. And then what it'll do is, okay, well, you're creating a table. Now you have to declare your column names and I don't know, name, ID, whatever I want to call it. I can declare my data types. Data types, by the way, it's something we'll start talking about next week. We know a little bit about them. And I can set all the comments for it. And then when I'm ready to like make it real, I just hit the save button, right? Except I don't have anything valid in here. So it's going to make me like fix all my errors. But basically what it does, and this is where it's kind of neat, is by making selections from buttons on the screen and taking all the right actions and filling out the form, it is writing my queries for me graphically. This is kind of interesting. So I point this out, by the way, to all the web developers here in the class, and any of the web developers that will watch this. Like if you're part of our programs here, eventually you will get to your PHP class or later classes where we do work with the MySQL database on Prometheus, and you get an account on here and you can operate the database by just clicking menu choices in the web browser. Or if you know your SQL code, you can just come in here and type your commands in like you normally would. And you can use this as the same kind of environment. The grander point is any of the work that we're doing inside of MySQL Workbench, we could also do it here. The difference would be where the data is stored. When I use this interface, It's stored on this web server on campus. When I run MySQL, because it's connected to the MySQL instance that's on my local computer, it's connecting to my local computer. However, MySQL Workbench can be configured to connect to a remote database, right? So that's a possibility as well. I always tell my web developers that you don't have to be a database expert to be a web developer, but understanding, how the data is structured and how to get into your database, for example, to fix problems, is really super helpful, right? And so this is one of the grand takeaways. So this is a product I normally show during this class so that my students become aware of the fact that there's this distinction between the actual database and the server. So MySQL Server, which is kind of a hidden piece of software that operates in the background of either your computer or some computer out on the internet. And then MySQL Workbench and PHPMyAdmin, which is a web-based DBMS, are database management systems that are independent of the server, but both have the capability of accessing the data and running queries on that data, regardless of where that data is located, right? PHPMyAdmin is designed to work on web hosting platforms and typically runs on top of Linux servers. And for web developers, is kind of considered the de facto web-based tool for accessing your database. For regular database developers, you're probably more apt to use MySQL Workbench. It is really a more powerful tool than PHPMyAdmin, but given the fact that PHPMyAdmin is included in just about every web hosting platform out there, it's very common and really good to know, especially if you do any professional web development work. Right. So that's kind of my little spiel just to introduce you to that product called PHPMyAdmin, and to give you a really strong distinction, if you weren't clear on it, how MySQL actually works. It is two separate components. The server software that holds the data runs in the background, can be on your own computer or out on the web somewhere. And then the database management system like PHPMyAdmin or MySQL Workbench that allows you to interface with the database. Take it to the last final step for anybody that's a software developer here or develops apps, or websites can be called apps too, I guess. We often learn to write code. So for example, in the web program, when you take the second level Java class, we write applications that remote connect to the Prometheus MySQL database so that you can create an app on your own computer that stores data out in the cloud, basically, and retrieves and can manipulate that data. Pretty powerful stuff, right? And by the way, folks, it's not a real app until it's got a database in the background. That's how a lot of developers feel, because databases are the primary way to store data and have it persist. All right, that ends this video.